Hello, A-Push. Welcome to Period 5. Today's period is from 1844 until 1877. It's kind of a small set of years, only 33 years, but we pack a lot of events into it. Specifically, it is in a lot of ways the culmination of a lot of themes that we saw in Period 4. And so we're going to kind of break those things down and see how we have the kind of rise of sectional violence and the ramping up to the Civil War and ultimately Reconstruction and the attempt to rebuild the country in the image of the Union. So let's get going with one of the main themes that we're continuing sort of from Period 4, which is U.S. expansion. James K. Polk, a Democrat, is elected in 1844, a slave owner, a classic sort of Democrat. He's actually called Young Hickory in sort of a throwback to Old Hickory, who was Andrew Jackson, so very much a Jacksonian Democrat in a lot of ways. And his focus, of course, is on manifest destiny, which is a big part of this period's sort of themes. Manifest destiny is this idea that sort of white American sort of national collective movement deserves to take over the West, that there's this sort of racial, cultural superiority, white supremacy that leads this sort of American hegemony to take these Western lands for use economically and sort of culturally. And of course, this also leads to some political debates, right? A lot of the debates that we're going to see comes from the acquisition of these lands via war or sort of takeovers or sort of encroachment into other lands, and then ultimately sort of the arguments about what we should do with those lands and whether or not they should be seen as lands for or free from slavery. And so this territorial acquisition we see get going pretty quickly. James K. Polk actually is arguing in his election campaign for United States acquiring the Oregon Territory, which we'll eventually see during his term in office. He only serves one term from 1844 to 1848. But so we acquire Oregon. We also will get into this Mexican-American War, the war with Mexico, sort of a newly independent Mexico that's only been independent for about 20 years, since 1821, 25 years. And we have this war with them from 1846 to 48, where the United States wins, and ultimately sort of we pay Mexico for this huge sort of swath of land that we now are currently sitting in California. And this includes the southwestern U.S., what is now California, New Mexico, Arizona, parts of Colorado, Utah, all the way sort of up into the parts of of Nevada, etc. And so that's a huge part of this, is this question about, okay, we have these territorial acquisitions, what do we do with them? Should we allow slavery in these new lands? Obviously, we know, going back to Period 4, there's also a theme of the idea of the increase of industrialization, of sort of market revolution principles, free market capitalism, these new sort of opportunities for markets to grow. Specifically in this time, as we talked about last time, we have new immigrants coming from Europe, specifically Ireland and Germany. Generally, these immigrants lived in ethnic communities and communities made up of people like themselves. So for example, in a lot of big cities, certainly Boston, parts of New York for sure, we have Irish sort of conclaves and areas where the Irish sort of live in these cities working in sort of new manufacturing factories. Germans tended to live sort of in German communities, but more in the Midwest and the sort of frontiers of what were then, the Midwest, the sort of plains, etc. So also sort of communities amongst themselves. But obviously, as we know, there's a big backlash to this. We have a lot of nativism, this idea that sort of the true Native American, in this case being sort of white American-born, what would have been kind of Whigs or really sort of know-nothings in the American Party, sort of arguing against and trying to limit the power and influence of immigrants coming to this country and now in the United States. Specifically, a lot of this nativism was anti-Catholic, so you sort of see this pro-Protestant, pro-Native American, meaning white in this case, argument. And in a lot of ways, this is also because the Democratic Party, in this age of the common man, as we talked about last time, uses this new influx of immigrants for their voting purposes, right? They get these new immigrants to vote for them. And so Democrats had a huge stronghold of this during that time. And the Know Nothing Party is a reaction to that. Again, it's called the American Party, but it was sort of the secret party because I guess Nativism wasn't super accepted publicly, and so it was a lot more secretive, so they would say, I know nothing, if they were asked. Obviously, due to all these new influx of people, this sort of question about power and slavery and sort of land acquisition, we of course have the federal government interested in pushing and encouraging this expansion into these lands because of economic growth, of creating more opportunity for cultural takeover and influence. So we have things like the Oregon Trail, right, where we all played the game when we were little on the old computer game of the Oregon Trail, where we tried to get through the sort of from Independence, Missouri, all the way out to the Oregon Territory. And this was an opportunity for settlers to go and try to start a life out there. The other thing the government does, of course, is they pass legislation. We see in 1862, sort of during the war, Republicans passed the Homestead Act, which is basically this law that encourages settlers to move out to sort of claim land. If they can take care of kind of 160 acres for about 5 years, then they get to keep it. And so sort of this encourages migration into these new lands that, of course, are not new. They've been there and have been inhabited for a long time. And of course, all of this sort of movement west leads to a lot of conflict, right? And so we have conflict specifically with the natives who live in these areas. We have the Sand Creek Massacre, the Battle of Little Bighorn, which famously happens as a huge victory by the Lakota over General Custer and his troops, and ultimately will eventually, in period 6, lead to what are called the Indian Wars and this idea of continued expansion into the West. The other thing that's happening, of course, is that continued sectional arguments, right? And so these questions about slavery are really happening because of the difference in the ways that these sections think about their own cultures and identities. So the North is really all about sort of free or wage labor, right? Focusing on sort of the opportunity to build and make things. It's all about manufacturing and industry. And they tend to have a lot more power in the House of Representatives because there's just more people who live in a lot of these places in the North, like especially cities. And so the House of Representatives tends to pass a lot of restrictions on slavery or on sort of more Southern influence. But the South, in sort of contrast to that, the South is obviously very agricultural, not just small sort of subsistence farming, but also obviously plantations and cash crops. A lot of the labor tends to be enslaved. Certainly the big money-making families and communities are using enslaved labor, and free labor is super helpful to make profits. Because of this, there is more power for the South in the Senate, right? And especially the presidency. So in a lot of ways, you see from basically 1844 until Lincoln, 1860, all of the presidents are pro-slavery. Almost all of them are Democrats, and the one Whig, who is Zachary Taylor, was a Virginian originally and owned slaves. So very much a very pro-slavery time for presidents and in the Senate, and so not a lot of laws are passed restricting that slavery. The other thing, of course, that's happening in the culmination of what we see during the Second Great Awakening is this push for abolition, right? So we have this huge rise of abolitionists. Generally speaking, though, their numbers are small. Their influence tends to be look a lot bigger in retrospect than I think it was at the time, because of course we now look back and want to believe that we were all abolitionists and we all hated slavery. But at the time, very few people in the country, and certainly more in the North than the South, but very few abolitionists, or at least certainly openly abolitionist members existed. However, they were very vocal, they were very visible. People like William Lloyd Garrison is a great example, someone to use. Frederick Douglass, of course. We looked at a lot of that stuff in class. They wrote pamphlets arguing against slavery, both morally and economically. We saw the formation of the American Anti-Slavery Society, and other sort of small anti-slavery societies. We, of course, had the Underground Railroad, where you had people actively working to help free enslaved people along the way. People like, obviously, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, all sorts of people who were helping, the Rankins in Kentucky. And then, of course, we had sort of more violent pushes. We had more slave rebellions. We had John Brown, who we'll talk about it shortly. And then, of course, there's also this push politically for, to be anti-slavery. We'll see the sort of Free Soil Party that exists in the 1850s for a hot minute. And eventually the Republican Party will be formed, which is this sort of political party that actually has an anti-slavery platform, that they, as political leaders, are arguing formally against slavery, and that's a big change. Southerners, of course, are responding to this abolition. They see this very much as a huge threat to their way of life, and they make a lot of arguments about how this is actually a threat to the American way of life, economically, culturally, socially. So a lot of things that are happening in response is we have stricter slave codes, stricter enforcement and regulations on things like education for enslaved people, on sort of groups of enslaved people hanging out. In a lot of communities, you used to have enslaved people would have Sundays off to sort of congregate and get together and hang out and party, and this was not allowed anymore under a lot of these new restrictions. We, of course, also had the limitation on preachers. People like Nat Turner was a preacher, an enslaved preacher, then this was not going to be allowed anymore. So this idea of trying to restrict these opportunities for enslaved people to get together and talk about these things was going to pick up. We also see that change from sort of arguing that it was an economic good and it was just a benefit to the country to, in the 1840s and 50s, the southern plantation owners arguing that it was actually a positive good, that it was beneficial for the enslaved people to have this sort of system that was going to benefit them. People like John C. Calhoun, George Fitzhugh. We, of course, have the Nullification Crisis in the 1830s, in the last period, and this idea that the South is going to basically reject any federal laws that they don't like and that feel unconstitutional and that unfairly target the sort of Southern peculiar institution, i.e. slavery. And of course, we know that this all leads to the sort of slow boulder rolling down the hill of the 1850s. And we talked about that in class, and you guys took a lot of notes on them. But you see from the Compromise of 1850 with sort of bringing California into the country as a free state, while also allowing popular sovereignty, which is a huge term to know about basically people in these territories or states deciding for themselves whether or not they want slavery. You have the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which criminalizes helping enslaved people, or and really kind of allows for the federal government to come into communities and kidnap formerly enslaved or currently enslaved people, or even free black people who could be called enslaved. So huge issue. We have the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. Which we'll see kind of leads to this idea of popular sovereignty, and kind of repeals this idea of the Missouri Compromise and that 3630 line on the southern sort of border of it. You, of course, see the Dred Scott v. Sanford decision in 1857, where the Supreme Court decides that basically slavery is actually legal everywhere because it is unconstitutional in that ruling to say that a state can be free or slave. If slavery is legal in some states, it should be legal in all states. And that's obviously a huge push in the direction of abolitionists arguing that slavery will never be stopped unless possibly with war or violence. And then, of course, John Brown and his raid on Harper's Ferry, which leads, in 1859, which leads to sort of this push possibly to maybe lighting the match towards civil war. Definitely know some of those things. These are really good elements to just little extra pieces of evidence for your DBQ to kind of keep in your back pocket, so you can just pull them out if depending on which ones are mentioned in the documents. If this is the period on that you will see on your DBQ, and of course, finally, the 1850s culminates in the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, where no Southerners, no electoral votes go from the South to Lincoln. He's not even on the ballot in many of those states, and you just see this sort of election of this anti-slavery Republican, which of course leads to the secession of many states. First in South Carolina in 1860 in December, and then more states following in 1861 in the beginning up to the beginning of the Civil War. So I'm going to talk briefly about the Civil War. Obviously, lots to take in, but really the main things to understand about it is that you have the sort of North and the Union versus the South and the Confederacy. The West is generally, is not totally involved, although certainly there are some regiments that are happening. Both sort of the North and the South really mobilize their economies and their societies to fight in this war. Remember, this war kind of starts as a war sort of to preserve the Union in the North. Like, Lincoln wants to preserve the Union, don't secede, and in a lot of ways he's very, he actually offers a lot of opportunities for the South not to leave, to accept slavery, to keep it, but ultimately this doesn't work. The South, of course, wants their slavery. They want slavery. They want to be able to decide whether or not they are going to keep it or not, and they believe the election of Lincoln is going to end it. Both the North and the South institute drafts, conscription acts that draft soldiers. It's important to know some of the differences in terms of their strengths and their weaknesses. Specifically, the North, they have more troops, right? They have more people. They tend to have more resources and technology, a lot more railroads, a lot more sort of, timber and ammunition, and a lot of the factories that they're producing these things are in the North. They also, of course, have the power of the federal government, which underratedly important. You can see how the power of federal government in a time of war can really be helpful to sort of to putting all of your work and industry and power behind like fighting a war. The South has some advantages too, though. They have more seasoned leadership. A lot of the best sort of generals of the United States Army and leaders in it tended to be from the South. They also, of course, had home field advantage, right? When the South are generally being invaded, and so in a lot of ways that leads to a lot of benefits for the South. The South sort of hunker down in this war of attrition. If they can outlast the Union troops, then ultimately they feel like they'll be victorious, so they can drag the war out as long as possible. But ultimately, the South loses, right? The Confederacy, of course, loses. The sort of advantages the North has is just, it sort of lasts too long. And in a lot of ways, there's a couple other things that happen. The South is ultimately completely destroyed, especially with like Sherman's March to the Sea. A lot of just total war, total devastation in the South. Richmond is burnt to the ground in a lot of ways. Atlanta is burnt to the ground. Charleston. The other thing that's important in this time, of course, is obviously the abolition of slavery that culminates in the 13th Amendment, which we'll talk about in a minute. But obviously, the importance of the Emancipation Proclamation, right? This is a reframing of the war in real time, and it's important to know that again, a sort of common misconception: the Emancipation Proclamation does not free all slaves. It is not an abolition of slavery. It is merely a sort of executive action to free enslaved people who live in the Confederate States. In the border states like Kentucky and Missouri and Maryland and Delaware, slavery is still allowed to exist because those states stayed in the Union. And so it is not really abolition. It's important to know that. But this Emancipation Proclamation does reframe this war. This war that begins as a war to sort of preserve the Union becomes a war to end slavery, to abolish slavery. And so that's a huge change, right? We saw that also reiterated in the Gettysburg Address that happens in November of that same year, when Lincoln reframes sort of the war, not as a war about preserving the Union, but about this sort of new rebirth of freedom, and focusing on the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. Obviously, the Emancipation Proclamation also brings African American soldiers into the war, which hugely benefit the Union, and in a lot of ways pushes the sort of victory toward the Union with this huge influx of new soldiers, and certainly soldiers who are going to fight because they have stakes in this fight. And of course, another sort of underrated piece is that this Emancipation Proclamation keeps Europe out of the war in a lot of ways. It convinces England and France to kind of stay out of it. It's less a war about economics and a more a moral fight. And in that way, along with sort of an interest in cotton that's discovered in other colonies, England and France kind of stay out of it. And so that leads, of course, to the victory in the Union. So let's move quickly into Reconstruction. So Reconstruction sort of begins in kind of 1865. It was really kind of started as the war was coming to a close. Lincoln starts to push this idea of states that have seceded coming back into the country. But ultimately, the important things to come out of Reconstruction are a couple things, specifically those Reconstruction Amendments. We have the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th, or I don't know which way I'm doing this. So 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. That's 1865, right? So slavery is not allowed anymore. We, of course, did talk about that exception, right? Unless found to have committed a crime. And so we've talked about how that exception leads to a lot of other problematic vagrancy laws and things like that during Reconstruction and afterwards in terms of Jim Crow. The 14th Amendment, which is hugely important in terms of, one, it legitimizes birthright citizenship. If you are born in this country, you are a citizen. So that's hugely impactful for those 4 million of formerly enslaved people, as well as now sort of immigrants going onward. And also equal protection of the laws, that all laws, that everyone has as citizens equal protection under the law, that we have equal protection regardless of our race or our religion, etc. And then, of course, the 15th Amendment is about voting rights, right? That you cannot discriminate on voting, for voting based on the color of your skin, your race. And so there are some ways the South kind of gets around this, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But first, all of these things are passed and pushed by radical Republicans, right? We have majorities of Republicans in the government, and the radical Republicans are really pro Reconstruction. They want to reconstruct the South in the image of the North, the Union. And so we're going to get things like Reconstruction Acts that put the sort of military districts together in the South. We see the Civil Rights Acts that help protect these newly freed African Americans from discriminatory laws and things like that. We see a lot of new black politicians, right? New senators, Hiram Revels, the first African American to be elected to Congress, as well as many other sort of local and national, federal representatives from the African American community. Huge push. We also have the Freedmen's Bureau. This is a federal government program that's going to try to protect and support these newly freed enslaved peoples in this new sort of reconstructed South. However, due to a lot of the erosion of these things and the sort of workarounds and loopholes that are created, we see by the 1870s, so basically by 1872, 73, 74, we see not only the sort of push by the redeemers against, of the South and the Democrats of the South against the sort of Republican leadership and federal sort of Reconstruction laws and pushes, but also we see the loopholes that are found by things like Jim Crow laws, right, where the South starts to pass these restrictions that kind of get around those things. They pass poll taxes and poll tests and grandfather clauses, where these restrictions aren't they're not based on race, but they happen to target and limit African Americans when they're allowed or not allowed to vote. We have, of course, just straight up terrorism with the KKK and the White League, groups that are going to scare African Americans into not voting, or they're going to straight up we see the rise of lynching and violence. And while these things are unlawful, there's no enforcement that arrests and stops them. So ultimately we see the sort of slow erosion of will in the North. They're tired of having to fight these things. And a huge the last piece of this, I would say, is that in 1873 there's an economic panic, the Panic of 1873, and in a lot of ways this refocused huge dip in and bust in the economic cycle is going to lead to many federal government officials and many Americans generally just sort of tired of fighting this. And ultimately the period ends in 1877 with that Compromise of 1877 where Rutherford B. Hayes becomes president even though he doesn't win the popular vote. And one of the things that the compromise gives is sort of the official formal end of Reconstruction. And so this period is sort of the build up to the sort of fight over slavery, the culmination in the Civil War, and the initial attempts to reform this country in a different image that ultimately kind of falls apart. And so definitely period 5, an important time for thinking about the things that came before it, and also the ways that it sets the look into the 20th century and the Gilded Age that's about to happen in period 6. All right, enjoy. Let me know if you have any questions. Please write to me. Again, follow for more videos. Any comments, I'm happy to try to answer. And have a wonderful day.